Friedrich Nietzsche was a German philosopher whose work has had an enormous influence on Western philosophy and thought in general. His books are dense and difficult to read, so here is a very short introduction to one of his most famous concepts, that God is dead. Now, when Nietzsche said that God is dead, he didn't mean that God literally died at some point in time, or that God stopped existing. He actually meant something much more complicated and profound than that. But let's begin with the story. In 1882, Nietzsche was staying in Genoa, Italy. At this point in his life, he had already published several books and essays that were not particularly well received by the public. Nietzsche suffered from poor health and debilitating migraines, and because of all of this, he was starting to feel alienated and isolated. One evening in January, Nietzsche was walking along the shore when he encountered a group of sailors celebrating after returning from a voyage. They were singing and drinking, and they were ecstatic about having witnessed something truly spectacular, a massive whale that had been washed ashore. The sailors were so excited about their discovery that they forgot all about finishing their evening meal. They decided to leave it behind and instead spend all night drinking and partying. This event made a big impression on Nietzsche, and he began to think about the nature of belief and disbelief, and how people come to know things and how they justify their beliefs. The next day, Nietzsche sat down and wrote a short text that begins with the famous line, "God is dead." In this text, which is called The Gay Science, Nietzsche explains how the sailors discovered the whale washed ashore. The sailors believed what they saw to be true. However, the text continues, "There are many who would rather believe in the non-existence of such gigantic sea creatures simply because it suits them better. For these people, the sailors' belief that the whale exists is inconvenient. It challenges their preconceived ideas about the world. So they try to convince themselves that the whale isn't real." So far, so simple. But Nietzsche then goes on to say that we should consider the possibility that one day someone may arrive and declare that not only does the whale exist, but also that it is immortal and will never die. If this person could make a convincing enough case, then the sailors would believe him. So Nietzsche says we have two groups of people. There are the sailors who believe in the reality of the whale because they saw it with their own eyes, and there are those who don't believe in the whale and prefer to cling to their skepticism. But if someone comes along and convinces them otherwise, they will believe that the whale is immortal. What Nietzsche is getting at with this little story is how our beliefs can often be based on nothing more than a preference for one viewpoint over another. We might cling to a particular view because it makes us feel comfortable, or we might reject certain ideas merely out of stubbornness. Nietzsche suggests that what we take to be truths about the world are often nothing more than conventional fictions that people prefer to believe. Nietzsche wasn't trying to argue that there aren't any objective truths out there waiting to be discovered. Instead, he wanted to show that the way we come to know things and the way we justify our beliefs are often much more complicated and uncertain than we like to admit. So what does all this have to do with God? Well, Nietzsche thought that the problem with traditional religious belief is that people often hold on to their religious views simply because they've been told to do so, or because it's what everyone else believes. This is why he says that God is dead. People no longer have faith in God because they've stopped believing in him. Rather, they continue to believe in him because it's what they've been taught to do. Nietzsche makes a distinction between two kinds of belief. He calls one kind slave morality and the other master morality. Slave morality is a morality that is born out of fear. It's the kind of morality that tells us to be weak is bad. This is because weak people are likely to be victims. And being a victim is a bad thing to be because it means that you are dependent on others. It's better to be strong because then you are less likely to be taken advantage of. Of course, this doesn't mean that Nietzsche was advocating a brutal, violent way of living. That's not what he meant at all. What he was doing was analyzing the psychology of how people come to value certain things over others. But there's another kind of morality, and this is master morality. And this is a morality that is based on strength, power, and vitality. Master morality values strength, courage, and ambition. It doesn't value weakness, timidity, or dependence. Nietzsche thought that traditional Christian morality is an example of slave morality, while the morality of ancient Greek cultures, particularly the morality found in the works of Homer, is an example of master morality. Nietzsche's concept of master morality has been heavily misinterpreted and distorted, especially by those on the political right. But it's important to remember that Nietzsche was unsuggesting that we go out and do whatever we want. He wasn't saying that might is right. Nietzsche was just trying to explain where certain moral values come from. He was pointing out that our ideas of good and evil are often nothing more than a reflection of our own self-interest. When we say that something is good, we often really mean that it benefits us in some way. And when we say that something is evil, we often really mean that it threatens our interests or the interests of those close to us. In his book Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche writes, "The whole of morality is ultimately based on sympathy. All its lights and confirmations are ultimately based on the feeling of dependence, on fear of falling, on a kind of self-preservation instinct which extends to other human beings." Nietzsche was saying that our ideas of good and evil are often nothing more than a reflection of our own self-interest. We tend to view things as good that make us feel good or that benefit us in some way. And we tend to view things as evil that make us feel bad or that threaten our interests or the interests of those close to us. And so it is with religion. Nietzsche thought that people continued to believe in God not because they had any real evidence for his existence, but simply because they had been taught to do so, and because it made them feel comfortable. Nietzsche said that the God is dead announcement was meant to be a provocation, a shock to the system designed to force people to think differently about the world. He knew that people would immediately stop believing in God simply because he had written a book saying that God is dead. But he hoped that his announcement would at least get people thinking about the nature of belief and the justification of their beliefs. Nietzsche was convinced that the traditional religious worldview was no longer tenable. He thought that the scientific discoveries of the 19th century had undermined the foundations of traditional religious belief, and he believed that it was time for humanity to move beyond God. This is why he said that we must become like the sailors in his story and learn to see the world as it really is, even if that means giving up the comforting illusions of traditional religious belief. It's only by doing so, Nietzsche thought, that we can hope to create a better, more humane future for ourselves. Of course, Nietzsche wasn't the first person to question the existence of God. There had been plenty of atheists before him. But what set Nietzsche apart was his willingness to challenge not just the idea of God, but the entire religious worldview that had dominated Western thought for centuries. For Nietzsche, the death of God was not merely a change in our understanding of the world, but a change in the way we live, a change in the way we value things, and a change in the way we treat each other. If you enjoyed this video, you might also enjoy another recent video I did on nihilism, which looks at one of the major philosophical problems that arises once you decide to stop believing in God. Thanks for watching.